I was a Mossad agent sent into Myanmar, an assignment cloaked in secrecy, buried deep under layers of plausible deniability. The mission's origin was classified, its purpose vague to most, yet the target was clear. Coordinates designated by our superiors, a region that had seen no Western interference for decades. Located in the dense, forgotten jungles of Myanmar, this place had been untouched by any human force for a long while. The map on our screens was an enigma, distorted, skewed, lines bled into one another like the strokes of a ghost's hand. I remember the first time the briefing took place. The room was cold, the air too sterile for comfort. Generals stood at attention, speaking in clipped tones, emphasizing how critical it was to remain unnoticed. They made sure to impart the weight of the mission, the need for absolute secrecy. Yet I could not shake the unease. It lingered, like a far-off whisper that gnawed at the edges of my mind. The secrecy seemed excessive, even for Mossad. It suggested something beyond the usual political maneuvering, beyond espionage. It suggested a presence I could not yet understand. My team was handpicked for this operation, each member with a distinct set of skills that could ensure the success of this covert mission. Captain Berman, a tall, stoic man with eyes like a hawk, was our field leader. He had seen too much, and perhaps that was the reason his voice was always calm, even when under duress. Medic Shani, her short, precise manner belied an intellect sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. She was our anchor, the one who kept us grounded in the midst of chaos, and yet there was an oddness in her behavior, a flicker of nervous energy beneath her composed exterior. We also had demolitions expert Yair, whose reckless attitude and fascination with explosives was tempered only by his remarkable technical skills. His carelessness in the field was legendary, but he had a deep, unsettling passion for understanding the unknown. Communications specialist Ophir, a quiet man, too quiet for comfort, was our only link to the outside world. He had an unexplainable connection to signals, an eerie ability to tune into frequencies others could not hear. Finally, there was me, Agent Yuri, a man who had seen things that no human should see, but had still clung to a semblance of sanity through sheer will. The briefing was wrapped up with a reminder of the stakes: international relations, military power, and access to resources in the event of success. But I felt a deeper threat beneath the surface, the kind that cannot be measured in political terms. Something ancient was watching us, waiting. A shift had occurred, imperceptible at first, but undeniable with each passing moment. The hairs on the back of my neck rose in silent warning, though I said nothing. In a place like that, silence often said more than words. As our transport descended into the jungle, the terrain below looked as foreign as the target itself. For a moment, I wondered what had been hidden for so long in this land, and why it had been kept away from the prying eyes of the world. The helicopter blades hummed a rhythmic tune, its noise overpowering the distant whispers of nature, yet the sound felt hollow, as if the jungle itself was trying to suppress our arrival. A strange, unsettling stillness fell upon the team as we neared the drop zone, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The target was a facility buried in the heart of the jungle, the architecture unlike anything I had ever seen. Ancient, yet with an unsettling modernity to it. We were tasked with gathering intelligence, photographs, schematics, any signs of technological advancements that could give us an edge in the global power struggle. But there were rumors, whispers among the higher-ups, that there was more to the place than just technology. It was said to be a relic, a remnant of something long forgotten, something that did not belong to this world. The words lingered, unsettling my thoughts. The moon was high above as we dropped into the darkness below. The dense canopy above the jungle floor seemed impenetrable, a mass of writhing black shadows. I could feel the air grow thick and heavy as we descended, the gravity of the mission pressing down on me. We were stepping into a place untouched by time, a place where the laws of nature could bend in ways we did not yet understand. And as the helicopters roared off into the distance, I couldn't shake the thought that we might never return. The mission was more than just another covert operation. It was a calculated gamble in a high-stakes geopolitical game. The intelligence we had gathered pointed to something unprecedented hidden in the depths of the Myanmar jungle. Rumors swirled about an ancient structure built by unknown hands, rumored to house technologies far beyond the scope of contemporary science. It was a place of extraordinary strategic value, potentially altering the balance of power between global superpowers. The reports, however, were fragmented, too many variables and inconsistencies to confirm the true nature of the threat. Our orders were explicit. We were to infiltrate the facility, retrieve any available data, and return without a trace. The success of this mission would give Mossad unprecedented leverage in the ongoing Cold War against rival intelligence agencies. The geopolitical ramifications were enormous. We were stepping into a territory where the margins between success and failure could not have been thinner. Our survival was secondary. The mission's success was paramount, as it would give Israel an advantage no one could anticipate. The stakes were no longer about national security. They were about securing the future. But as we neared the objective, the weight of the operation began to settle deeper. This was not a typical intelligence-gathering exercise. The very nature of the mission suggested something beyond espionage. We were being tasked with entering a domain where the rules of warfare and technology seemed irrelevant. We had been given no details on what the enemy might look like, or how it might strike back should we be discovered. And yet, we were expected to make our way inside and extract information as though it were business as usual. There was a pervasive sense that something was being withheld from us, something crucial, but just out of reach. The higher-ups seemed calm, almost too calm, given the stakes. They had provided no context for the structure, no backstory, just a series of cryptic orders and vague descriptions. Our mission was straightforward: infiltrate, observe, report, and return. Yet, no one could shake the feeling that this operation was different from any other we had ever undertaken. As we approached the target, the sense of unease escalated, becoming almost tangible. We had been trained for any number of scenarios: hostile encounters, sabotage, even nuclear threats. But the possibility of something so fundamentally unnatural was outside the scope of our training. What we faced could not be explained by the usual intelligence or military tactics. We were dealing with something older than civilization itself, something that no human hand had ever touched. It was a risk we could not calculate. But we had no choice. Our mission was set, and the failure of this operation was not an option. We moved in silence, through dense, humid jungle, the oppressive heat settling in like a blanket. The threat wasn't just the physical environment or the hostile forces. There was something else pressing in on us, unseen but undeniably present. The night air felt thick, and the weight of our equipment seemed heavier with each step. The jungle, once a living entity teeming with life, now felt like a tomb. And beneath it all, the ever-present sense of being watched, though no eyes could be seen. Captain Berman was our leader, a man with an aura of command that felt as much a weapon as the firearms we carried. His age was indeterminate, somewhere in his mid-40s, but the lines on his face told stories of decades spent in the field. His eyes, piercing and unwavering, had the kind of cold precision one would expect from someone who had seen too much and felt too little. He carried the weight of Mossad's legacy on his shoulders, and his every decision was calculated with ruthless efficiency. Berman had never spoken of his past, but we all knew it was a tapestry woven with shadowy operations across the globe. Despite his stern exterior, there was a soft edge to his presence. In quiet moments, you could sense the weight of his internal battles, though he would never admit it. His leadership was unquestioned, calm under pressure, tactical genius in the field. Yet something about him felt disconnected, as if he was a man who had long since accepted that the world's horrors were not for understanding, but for enduring. Then there was Shani, our medic. She was a woman of few words, but those words, when spoken, carried the cold rationality of a scientist. She was in her early 30s, tall and slender, her hair tied back in a tight bun that spoke of discipline, of a mind sharp enough to assess any medical crisis within seconds. Shani's calm exterior was her shield, but underneath, she was harboring a quiet unease that none of us could fully understand. She had been part of the Mossad's clandestine medical division for years, and her hands had saved more lives than she cared to count. Yet, there was something about the mission that rattled her. A slight tremor in her fingers when she checked vitals, a constant gaze over her shoulder when she thought no one was looking. It was as if she was already sensing the wrongness that was to come. Yair, our demolitions expert, was the opposite of Shani in many ways. Where she was reserved and methodical, Yair was reckless and impetuous. A man in his late 20s, with a boyish grin and eyes that burned with an unquenchable thirst for destruction. His expertise was in explosives, a talent honed in combat zones across the world. But his recklessness was something else, almost pathological. He had a knack for setting explosives in the most improbable ways, and a strange fascination with the art of blowing things apart. There was a darkness in Yair that, while initially unsettling, became endearing over time. Yet he had a compulsion for taking risks that bordered on dangerous. And I knew, deep down, that one of these days, one of his calculated risks would lead to something beyond even his control. Yair's obsession with explosives wasn't just professional, it was personal. He once told me that he could blow something up and rebuild it, piece by piece, with a sense of reverence. His need to destroy seemed inseparable from his need to create, as if he was caught between worlds. Ophir, our communications specialist, was the most enigmatic of us all. Soft-spoken, almost introverted, he seemed to live within the hum of his equipment. His role was to keep us connected to headquarters, to provide support when needed, and to intercept any communication signals that could give us an edge. But there was something unsettling about his ability to tune into frequencies that no one else could hear. At first, we thought it was just his technical genius. He had a gift for languages, for deciphering codes, and for understanding patterns in static noise. But as the mission progressed, it became clear that something deeper was at play. Ophir's connection to the strange signals we encountered during our journey was growing stronger. He began to mutter phrases in languages no one recognized, his fingers twitching as though he were typing out invisible codes in the air. It was as if the signals were beginning to get inside his mind, breaking down the walls between reality and something else. I didn't know whether it was the mission or the environment, but he was changing, and I could feel it. And then there was me, Agent Yuri. I was a man who had built a reputation for staying calm under pressure, for reading situations with a precision that came from years of experience. I had seen the dark side of the world, infiltrating organizations and gathering intel in hostile territories. But this mission was different. The jungle, the facility, the ever-growing sense of being watched, it was all starting to erode something within me. I was supposed to be the rational one, the one who held the team together when things got tough. But as we got closer to our objective, I felt a creeping dread take hold of me. It was the sensation of something far beyond my understanding, something that wasn't human, that wasn't of this world. I didn't share these thoughts with anyone. It was my job to lead, to make decisions, to keep the mission on track. But deep down, I was already beginning to question whether this mission was one that any of us would be able to survive. The briefing room was stark, no windows, just the cold flicker of overhead fluorescent lights casting long shadows across the metal table where we sat. Our faces were expressionless, but inside, we all felt the weight of what lay ahead. We had been briefed, but not in any conventional sense. The mission parameters were as minimal as they were precise. Our objective was simple: infiltrate the facility, retrieve any data of interest, and return without a trace. But the lack of detail about what lay inside the facility was unsettling. The few photographs we had seen were grainy, taken from a distance. The architecture of the structure seemed alien, as if the building itself had been made by an unknown hand, perhaps even from a time before human civilization. The walls appeared to be a strange mix of ancient stone and some kind of metal we had never encountered. What little information we had was classified at the highest level, too sensitive for even high-ranking officials to discuss openly. It was all too familiar, an operation wrapped in secrecy with too many unanswered questions. Captain Berman, ever the picture of composure, stood at the head of the table speaking in measured tones. His voice was calm, betraying no hint of the unease that had begun to gnaw at my insides. He briefed us on the terrain, the necessary equipment, and the communications protocol. He outlined the extraction plan in meticulous detail, how we would enter the target zone under cover of night, how we would disable any security systems, and how we would avoid detection. It was a textbook plan, but there was something about the way Berman spoke that suggested he knew something more. Something none of us had been told. Shawnee's brow furrowed slightly as she examined the list of medical supplies we had been issued. I noticed her glance at the rest of us, her eyes betraying the first signs of concern. She had always been analytical, but there was something different in her gaze today, an undercurrent of dread that was impossible to ignore. Yair, as usual, seemed distracted, his attention flicking between the explosives gear he was assembling and the digital map of the facility. His fingers drummed absently on the table as though he were waiting for something to happen, something that we couldn't yet understand. His usual bravado was replaced by a tense, almost anticipatory energy. Ophir, the communications specialist, remained quiet, his eyes glued to his tablet screen as he typed in commands and adjusted frequencies. I could tell he was already anticipating the strange signals we had been warned about. Ophir had always been the first to notice anomalies in the system, whether they were faint signals from distant sources or disturbances in the digital ether. But this time, his silence was different. He was looking at something on the screen, something that seemed to pull him deeper into the machine, away from the rest of us. It was as if he was already receiving information from somewhere, or someone, that was not supposed to be there. I looked over at the team, each of us preparing for the mission in our own way. Berman's orders were clear. No one was to deviate from the plan, and we were to remain on comms at all times. The facility's location was remote, deep within the jungle, isolated from the nearest civilian settlement. Our insertion point would be a small, unmarked clearing. No signs, no landmarks, a straightforward drop, then a 3-hour trek to the facility. It was a standard operation in many ways, but the air around us felt charged, as though the very atmosphere was aware of what we were about to do. The jungle outside the walls of the compound had a living quality to it, a kind of oppressive presence that made it seem like the trees themselves were waiting, watching, and listening. I could not shake the sense of something darker at work here. It was not the mission that unsettled me. It was what we were being sent into, and the unexplained nature of the objective. Our intel was sparse, almost intentionally so, but something deep inside me screamed that we were not prepared for what awaited us in the jungle. Whatever lay inside that facility was far beyond our understanding, and the stakes were no longer just about national security. It was about something older, something far more dangerous than any enemy we had ever faced. The briefings were designed to keep us focused on the mission, but beneath the surface I could feel the tension rising, an intuition that told me this was a mission that would either break us or change us forever. The briefing concluded with final checks. Weapons, equipment, comms, everything was inspected one last time. Berman's gaze swept across the team, pausing just long enough to assess our readiness. He gave a single nod of approval, then turned and walked toward the exit. As the door closed behind him, I could feel it, an invisible pressure pressing down on me, and the oppressive silence that followed. It was as though the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of our mission, and now held it, suspended in the air. With one final breath, I followed Berman out of the briefing room. The mission was about to begin, and in that moment I understood, no matter how well we had prepared, we were stepping into the unknown. The jungle held its breath, and so did I. The helicopter ride was uneventful, a steady hum of blades cutting through the thick, humid air as we approached the drop zone. The vast expanse of the jungle stretched below us like a living, breathing entity, dense, untamed, and seemingly infinite. The canopy below us was a wall of green, broken only by the occasional flash of rivers cutting through the terrain, like veins of silver threading their way through the heart of the forest. The weight of the moment was settling in, a quiet tension that seemed to grow with every passing minute. It was as though the land itself was waiting for us to land, silent, expectant. Berman stood by the open door of the helicopter, his face illuminated by the flickering light from the cockpit. He surveyed the landscape with an almost detached calm, his expression unreadable. There was no sign of fear in his eyes, just a sharp, unwavering focus on the task ahead. I found myself watching him, trying to read his face, wondering if he was thinking about the same things I was. The overwhelming silence of the jungle below us, the sense that we were about to cross into something far beyond our control. 1 minute, Berman's voice crackled over the comms, pulling me from my thoughts. Prepare for insertion. We had all checked our gear one final time before boarding. The weight of our weapons and equipment felt familiar, but it didn't quite sit right. Too heavy, too burdensome. The oxygen tanks on our backs hummed softly, the faint hiss of pressurized air the only sound in the otherwise silent cabin. I could hear my heart beating in my chest, too loud, too fast. I focused on the sound of the helicopter blades, their rhythmic chop a kind of mechanical lullaby in the chaos of my thoughts. The aircraft descended, the jungle below now only a few hundred feet away. The thick canopy gave way to an opening, a small, barely visible clearing just large enough for a quick drop. As we hovered over it, the trees seemed to recoil, as though the land itself was reacting to our presence. The wind from the helicopter's rotors stirred the leaves below, creating a swirling vortex of green and brown. The smell of the earth, damp, musty, and thick with decay, began to fill the cabin, seeping into my lungs with every breath. It was a scent I had become all too familiar with during my time in the field, but here, in this place, it felt different. It felt wrong. Drop zone is clear, Berman's voice cut through the noise, calm as ever. Go, go, go! With practiced precision, we jumped from the helicopter, our boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. The air was thick with humidity, wrapping around us like a suffocating blanket. For a moment, I could not see anything but the blur of green around me, the foliage pressing in on all sides. The jungle was alive, vibrant with the sounds of unseen creatures and the rustle of the leaves above. But beneath it all, there was an eerie stillness, a tension that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It felt as though the jungle was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We moved quickly, staying low and making our way toward the facility's location. The undergrowth was dense, but we had trained for this. Our footsteps were silent, our movements fluid. The terrain was treacherous, with thick vines and mud slick underfoot. But we pressed on, our destination set in our minds. The darkness of the jungle seemed to deepen as we ventured farther in. The canopy overhead blocked out much of the moonlight, leaving us to navigate by the faint glow of our night vision goggles. Despite our training, there was something disorienting about the jungle's vastness. It felt as though the very landscape was shifting beneath us. The trees were too tall, their trunks twisted in strange angles. The leaves rustled in ways that felt unnatural, as though the wind was guiding them, shaping them. We passed no signs of wildlife, no distant calls of animals or insects. It was as though we had entered a place where nature itself had gone silent, or worse, had been silenced. As we moved deeper, the temperature seemed to drop inexplicably. A chill spread across my skin, and the air tasted metallic, sharp against my tongue. I looked at my team, each of us moving in sync, our breath steady, our weapons at the ready. The further we went, the heavier the silence became. The only sound was the rhythmic crunch of our boots against the forest floor, but even that seemed muffled, as though the jungle itself was absorbing it. Berman held up his hand, signaling for us to stop. We huddled together, crouching low in the shadows of the towering trees. The faint glow of our equipment illuminated our faces, casting long, distorted shadows against the bark. I could feel my pulse quicken as Berman scanned the horizon, his eyes narrowing. "This is it," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "The facility's just ahead." There was a sense of finality in his words, as though everything had led to this moment. But deep down, I felt the creeping unease again, more pronounced now. It was as though we had entered a place that was not meant for humans, an ancient domain, untouched by time, where the laws of nature no longer applied. I turned to look at the team. Shani was adjusting her medical kit, her face pale in the dim light. Yair was bouncing on his heels, eager for the next phase, his usual grin absent from his face. Ophir stood off to the side, his eyes flickering back and forth between the darkness and the glowing symbols on his tablet. I caught his gaze for a split second. There was something in his eyes, something distant and unfocused. Before I could say anything, Berman gave the signal, and we moved forward once more, stepping deeper into the jungle, our destination now just beyond the veil of the trees. We emerged from the dense foliage into a clearing that seemed too unnatural to exist in the midst of the jungle. The facility loomed before us, its strange silhouette rising from the earth like a long-forgotten relic. The walls were smooth, metallic, and gleamed under the moonlight. But there was no sign of the technology that would explain such an advanced structure. The architecture was unlike anything I had ever seen, a strange blend of organic curves and angular geometric lines that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. It was as though the building was not simply constructed, but grown, the materials flowing together in an unnatural harmony. The air around the facility was dense, almost charged, and the temperature seemed to fluctuate, becoming impossibly cold as we approached. We moved cautiously, staying low and keeping to the shadows. There were no guards, no signs of life, but that only heightened the sense of unease that had been building within me. The silence here was absolute. Nothing moved. The distant sounds of the jungle seemed to fade away, absorbed by the oppressive presence of the facility. Even the air felt heavier, as though it was thick with the weight of the secrets held within the walls. Berman signaled us forward, and we crept towards the entrance. The door was massive, made of the same smooth metallic material as the rest of the structure, but it had no handles, no visible means of entry. Instead, it seemed to respond to our presence. As we approached, a low hum vibrated through the air, and the door slowly began to slide open, as though beckoning us inside. There was no sound of machinery, no mechanical whirring. It opened with a fluid, unsettling grace, as if the building itself was alive, aware of our arrival. Inside, the air was colder still, and the scent of sterile, metallic walls hit me immediately. The corridor before us stretched out into darkness, illuminated only by faint, flickering lights along the ceiling. The walls were adorned with strange symbols, etched into the surface in a language I could not recognize. It was not like any human script I had ever encountered. The glyphs seemed to shimmer and pulse as if they were alive, shifting under our gaze. I looked back at the team, my breath caught in my throat. We were stepping into something ancient, something far beyond our understanding. But the mission demanded that we press on, that we gather what we could and leave no matter the cost. Berman stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the passage ahead. "Stay close. We're not alone here," he muttered under his breath, though his voice betrayed no hint of fear. The words sent a shiver down my spine. It was as if he too could sense the unnatural presence in the air, a force that was watching us, waiting for us to make the wrong move. We moved down the corridor, our boots muffled against the smooth floor. The temperature seemed to drop further with each step we took. I could see my breath in the air, a faint mist swirling around me as I exhaled. The lights overhead flickered erratically, casting long shadows that seemed to twitch and move on their own. Every step I took felt like a violation of something that should have remained untouched. We were intruders, and it was clear that the facility knew it. The deeper we went, the more disorienting the environment became. The corridors twisted in impossible angles, the geometry of the building defying the natural laws we understood. At times, the floor seemed to slope at impossible gradients, or the walls would shift ever so slightly, as though the building itself was responding to our presence. My sense of direction faltered. I tried to focus, to keep my bearings, but everything around me was alien, wrong. The further we went, the more the world itself seemed to warp, pulling at the edges of my perception. Suddenly, I heard a noise. Faint at first, like a whisper in the distance, carried on a breeze that I could not feel. It was a soft murmur, a chant. I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen. The others had heard it too. Shawnee's eyes darted nervously, and I could see her hands tightening around her medical kit. Yair had stopped as well, his usual bravado replaced by an expression of quiet confusion. Even Berman looked uneasy, his hand resting on his weapon as he scanned the shadows. Ofer was the first to speak, his voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" he asked, though it seemed unnecessary. We all heard it. It was faint but growing louder, an indistinct chorus of voices. The sound was coming from deeper within the facility, echoing through the corridors like the remnants of some ancient ritual. It was a sound I could not place, too alien, too otherworldly. It was as though the voices themselves were calling to us, beckoning us forward. But there was no time to analyze the source. The mission had to continue, no matter the growing sense of dread gnawing at our minds. We pushed forward, moving down the hallway, the whispering voices growing louder with every step. It was a sound I could not ignore, a constant pressure on my mind, urging me to listen, to understand. But I resisted the pull. I had to resist. We all did. Whatever lay ahead, it was not meant for us. The corridor ahead opened up into a massive chamber, its size staggering. It was circular. The walls curved in a way that made it feel as though we were standing at the center of something enormous. The ceiling was lost in darkness, stretching upward far beyond our sight. The floor was uneven, cracked in places, as though time itself had taken its toll on the structure. But what caught my attention was the centerpiece of the room, a large black obelisk standing in the middle of the chamber, covered in the same strange symbols that adorned the walls. The obelisk thrummed with energy, a low hum vibrating through the air. It was ancient, yet alive, and it felt as though it was watching us, waiting for us to make our move. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to fill the entire room. The air grew thick with an almost palpable energy, and I could feel it in my chest, in my bones, something ancient, something incomprehensible. I turned to Berman, but he was already moving toward the obelisk. "Get the data," he ordered quietly. His voice was distant, as though he too was becoming consumed by the force that surrounded us. We had no choice but to follow. We spread out across the chamber, the cold metallic hum of the obelisk vibrating in the air, growing stronger with each step we took. Our footsteps were eerily muffled, as though the very floor was absorbing sound. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the oppressive energy pressing down on us from every direction. The whispering voices were still there, constant, filling the space like a fog that we couldn't see but could feel in the pit of our stomachs. I could see the others moving in a practiced, professional manner, Berman leading the way to the obelisk, Yair already circling the perimeter, and Shani examining the walls for any signs of life. Ofer, however, was distant. His eyes were fixed on his tablet, his fingers moving in a manner that seemed almost mechanical. It was as though he had entered a trance, his connection to the strange energy of the place growing stronger with each passing second. I focused on my own task, checking the room for anything that could provide answers. The symbols etched into the walls continued to shift under my gaze, flickering and changing like living things. The faint glow from their depths seemed to pulse in time with the vibrations of the obelisk, casting long, disturbing shadows that twisted unnaturally across the walls. I felt the weight of these symbols pressing into my consciousness, as if they were trying to communicate with me. But I pushed the thought aside, focusing on the mission at hand. I couldn't afford to be distracted by this place. The equipment we carried was standard for covert operations: small, portable cameras, data extractors, and sensors designed to gather information without alerting anyone to our presence. We had no idea what kind of security the facility might have, but we couldn't afford to waste time. Time was our enemy here, and every minute we spent standing still felt like a minute we couldn't afford to lose. As I checked the data extractor, I realized the anomaly. Nothing was registering. The device was dead. I double-checked the power levels, but the battery gauge was full. The tech should have been working, but it wasn't. Whatever force was present here, it was interfering with our equipment. A cold dread spread across my chest, tightening like a vice. "Berman," I whispered, taking a cautious step toward him. He was still fixated on the obelisk, his back turned to me. His posture was rigid, like a man lost in thought or perhaps in some kind of trance. The whispers were louder now, more distinct, and for a brief moment, I thought I heard my name, faint but clear, called from the depths of the chamber. I froze, turning quickly to check the rest of the team. Yair was fiddling with a device near the wall, his face contorted in concentration, but he didn't seem to hear anything. Shani was still studying the walls, but there was an unnatural stillness in her movements. Ophir, too, had become eerily quiet, his usual hum of activity now replaced by an unsettling silence. I could feel my heart race in my chest. Something was wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint what. I turned back to Berman, his form now standing motionless in front of the obelisk. "Berman," I repeated, my voice just above a whisper. He didn't respond at first, and I was about to call out again when he finally spoke, his voice low and almost reverent. "It's calling us," he said, his voice strained. "We're supposed to understand it." There was a coldness in his tone, something detached, as though he wasn't fully aware of what he was saying. I approached him cautiously, my senses screaming at me to turn back, to leave this place before it consumed us all. But I couldn't. The mission demanded that we push forward. "We need to keep moving," I said, my voice firmer this time. "We can't afford to lose focus. Get the data. The mission comes first." Berman hesitated for a moment before nodding, though his gaze never left the obelisk. I could see it now, a strange reverence in his eyes, as if he was no longer the leader of our team, but a follower of something far greater than himself. A shiver ran down my spine, and I turned back to check on the rest of the team. Yair was the first to speak. "Something's not right," he muttered under his breath. "I've been trying to scan the walls, but there's nothing. The energy readings are all over the place. It's like the place is alive in a way we can't understand." Shani was next, her voice a little too steady, too controlled. "There are no biological life signs, no animals, no plants. This place is sterile, but not in a normal way. It's like everything is drained, sucked dry." I nodded, glancing back at the obelisk, now vibrating with a frequency I could feel deep in my chest. "We need to get what we came for and get out," I said, trying to push the gnawing sensation of dread from my mind. "Something's not right here, and I don't trust it." But even as I spoke, I could feel the pull, the subtle tug at the edges of my consciousness. The obelisk was calling to us, whispering to us in ways that transcended language. It was a force that was older than anything we had ever encountered, and I could feel it seeping into my thoughts, tainting my mind. There was no way to explain it, no words to describe it. But I knew, deep down, I couldn't trust myself here. We moved deeper into the chamber, the mission unfolding, yet the unease in my chest grew with every step. The deeper we went, the harder it became to focus on the task at hand. The whispers had changed now, growing louder, more urgent, and I could feel myself losing touch with reality. The walls seemed to shift before my eyes, and the floor began to twist beneath my feet. My vision blurred, and I caught myself reaching for the obelisk without realizing it. Yair's voice snapped me out of my daze. "Uri, what are you doing?" His tone was sharp, filled with panic. I pulled my hand back, realizing with a jolt how close I had come to touching the surface of the obelisk. It had been calling me, pulling me closer without me even realizing it. The room was spinning now, the walls stretching and contracting in ways that defied logic. The whispers were louder, almost deafening, and I could hear my name being called from somewhere deep within the bowels of the facility. "We need to leave," I said, my voice unsteady, my mind racing. But Berman didn't respond. None of us did. We were already too far into the web we couldn't escape. The air felt thick, charged in a way I could not explain. The further we moved through the facility, the more the space seemed to distort. It was as though the very fabric of reality was stretching, pulling taut. The walls, once seemingly solid, now appeared to waver at the edges of my vision as if they were not quite part of this world. Shadows flickered across the floor, growing longer, thicker, and shifting in ways they should not have. The whispers, too, had changed. They were no longer vague, unintelligible murmurs. Now they were distinct voices, overlapping each other in a cacophony that filled my mind like an invasive presence. They were calling our names, shouting at us to stop, to turn back. But it was too late. We were already too deep into the madness. Berman, still fixated on the obelisk, had begun to mumble words under his breath. His eyes were glazed over, distant, as though he were in some trance. His hands trembled, yet his gaze remained locked on the object, as if it were the only thing holding him to reality. I felt the pull too, an invisible force that seemed to tug at my very core. But I fought against it, forcing myself to focus on the task at hand. We couldn't afford to be distracted. I couldn't afford to lose my grip. It was then that I noticed the first anomaly. It began as a flicker in the corner of my eye, a shape darting just beyond the threshold of my vision, too quick to fully register. I blinked, then froze, staring at the spot. For a brief second, it seemed like the air itself was bending, twisting like a mirage on the horizon. My mind tried to rationalize it, but the sensation was too strong to ignore. The space around me was warping, and the shadows, no longer confined to their usual shapes, began to creep along the walls like living things, their edges fuzzy, undulating. I heard a crack, a sound like something snapping, but too high-pitched, too unnatural. The walls around us seemed to inhale and exhale with the sound, contracting and expanding in a rhythm that was not our own. I tried to steady my breathing, but it was becoming harder to focus, harder to stay grounded. "Berman," I called, my voice strained. "Do you see this?" Berman didn't respond, his gaze fixed forward, his hands twitching as if he were battling some unseen force. I looked around at the rest of the team. Yair, who had been quietly assessing the perimeter, was now staring at the floor, his eyes wide, mouth slightly agape. His hands gripped his explosives gear with white knuckles, but his body was rigid, frozen in place. He was staring at something I could not see. "Yair?" I asked, stepping toward him. "What's going on?" He didn't respond. His eyes were locked on a spot on the floor, nothing more than a patch of dust and broken concrete, yet he seemed transfixed, as though it were something far more important. I followed his gaze, my eyes narrowing, trying to make sense of it. That's when I saw it, the faintest outline of a figure just at the edge of the light. It was indistinct, a shadow that didn't belong, shifting and flickering as if it were only half-formed. The air around it seemed to pulse, rippling like the surface of a disturbed pond. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't just a trick of the light. The shape was there, real and undeniable. And then it moved. In an instant, the figure darted forward, faster than anything humanly possible, vanishing into the darkness of the hallway. Yair flinched, his body jerking as if something had grabbed him, but when I looked at him, his expression was blank, almost empty, like a man caught between worlds. "We need to get out of here," I muttered, more to myself than to the others. But my words fell flat, drowned out by the rising pressure in the air. The temperature had dropped even further, and I could feel it in my chest now, an unnatural cold that settled into my bones, a coldness that didn't belong to this place. The whispers had grown louder, more frantic. The voices were no longer just distant. Now they were right beside me, inside my head. I could feel them clawing at my thoughts, murmuring things I could not understand. Shani, who had been moving towards the wall to examine another set of symbols, suddenly stopped. She stiffened, and her eyes darted around, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. "Did anyone hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. There's something else here. Something not human." I nodded, my throat dry. I had heard it too. The scrape of metal on stone, a sound like something dragging across the floor just beyond our reach. The air was alive with it, and my senses were overloaded. It felt like the facility was closing in on us, the walls narrowing, the space compressing. "Berman," I called again, my voice firm this time. But he still didn't respond. He was too far gone. I could see it now, the way his body had begun to sway slightly, like a puppet on strings, caught in the trance of whatever force was holding him. His lips moved, but the words were too soft, too foreign to make out. I reached for my weapon, my fingers trembling as I did, but just as I was about to speak, something caught my eye. The walls, once smooth and unbroken, were now showing signs of damage. Deep gouges, as if something had scratched them from within. The marks were fresh, yet there was no sign of any creature. I could feel my breath quicken, my heart pounding in my chest. The walls, the floors, the air, everything was shifting, warping, changing. The facility wasn't just alive. It was fighting back. "We need to leave now," I said, more urgently this time, stepping back toward the entrance. But as I turned to lead the team out, I noticed something. The door we had come through. Had it always been there? No, it was different now. The opening had closed in on itself, as though the walls were slowly sealing us inside. We were trapped. Panic gripped me as I stared at the now sealed entrance. The door had vanished into the wall as though the building itself had swallowed it whole. I could feel the oppressive silence building, suffocating us in its weight. The air had grown thicker, more viscous, and I could hear the faintest sound, a whisper, coming from all around us. It was no longer confined to the walls. The whispers were in the very air, twisting and pulling at my thoughts. The sensation of being watched grew unbearable, and I turned to face my team. Shani was frozen, her face pale and drenched in sweat. She was staring at the floor, her eyes wide and unfocused. Something was wrong with her. The usual calm confidence she exuded had shattered. I moved closer, but as I did, I saw what had caught her attention. At her feet were two faint, glowing footprints in the dust. They were not from any of us, that much was certain. The footprints were imprinted into the ground with unnatural precision, their edges too sharp, too perfect, as if they had been made by something that didn't walk on this earth. "Shani," I whispered urgently, but she didn't respond. She was too transfixed, too absorbed in the strange markings on the floor. I stepped closer, my boots making no sound against the floor, despite the growing unease that pressed against me. The footprints led deeper into the chamber, their faint glow pulsating as if beckoning us forward. The sound of our breathing was the only thing I could hear now, loud, frantic, echoing through the chamber. But there was something else beneath the surface, a deeper hum that rattled my bones, vibrating in sync with the flickering lights above us. "Captain," I said, my voice shaking, "we need to leave. Now." But Berman didn't respond. He was still standing in front of the obelisk, his body swaying ever so slightly. I could see his lips moving again, but this time the words were sharper, more insistent, as if he were having a conversation with something we couldn't see. The whispers in the room had intensified, now almost deafening. They were coming from everywhere, from the walls, from the air itself, from the depths of the building, calling us by name. Suddenly I felt it. A cold hand, something unseen, brushed against my shoulder. It wasn't physical, but it was there, a sensation so tangible it made my skin crawl. My breath hitched, and I spun around, but there was nothing, just the flickering lights, the shadowed corners, and the oppressive presence of the facility pressing down on us. Yair, his face contorted in disbelief, took a step backward, his hands shaking as he gripped his explosives gear tighter. "What the hell is happening?" he muttered, his voice almost lost in the growing cacophony. Something's wrong. I've seen this before." I turned toward him, my heart racing. Seen what before? But before he could respond, the shadows in the corners of the room began to shift. It wasn't just the usual play of light. The shadows were moving on their own, stretching and shrinking in impossible angles. At first I thought it was just the flickering lights playing tricks on my eyes. But then I saw it, a shape, human in form, emerging from the darkness. It was indistinct at first, an amorphous blur, but as it stepped forward, it became clearer. A figure, too tall to be human, with limbs that twisted and bent at unnatural angles. Its body seemed to melt and reshape itself, its edges flickering and distorting like a broken film reel. I froze, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything human at all. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, its long, spindly arms reaching out toward us. As it moved, the shadows seemed to follow it, clinging to its body like a second skin. The whispering voices intensified, now a chorus of distorted, garbled sounds, as if the very air around us had been turned into a resonating chamber for something ancient and incomprehensible. "Move!" I shouted, grabbing Yair's arm and pulling him toward the door, but there was no time. The figure, if it could even be called that, was upon us. Its limbs twisted in impossible ways, stretching out in jerky movements, closing the distance between us faster than I thought possible. The air grew colder still, and a crushing pressure built up in my chest, as though the weight of the world had settled on me. My mind was swimming with the oppressive presence of the entity, its very existence bending the rules of nature. I reached for my weapon, but the moment I pulled the trigger, nothing happened. The weapon misfired, the rounds never leaving the chamber, and I could feel my breath quicken, my panic rising. The thing before us was not affected by human means. Nothing we had could stop it. "Run!" Berman's voice rang out sharp and clear, cutting through the chaos. He had snapped out of his trance, and his face was a mask of calm determination. "We have to get out of here, now." Without hesitation, I turned and sprinted toward the entrance, toward the place that had swallowed itself mere moments ago. The others followed, but as we reached the spot where the door had once been, we found ourselves facing an impenetrable wall of solid stone. The room had closed in on us, sealing us inside. The only way out was forward, but the darkness ahead was deeper, colder, and filled with an overwhelming sense of wrongness. The figure, whatever it was, had stopped at the far end of the room, its shape shifting and warping as it stared at us, unmoving. I could feel the walls pressing in around me, and in the pit of my stomach, I knew there was no escape. The facility was alive, breathing with the entity within it. The whispers were no longer just in the air. They were in my head, filling every corner of my mind, drowning out my thoughts. There was no running from it. There was only the suffocating dread that we had crossed a threshold, and we were no longer in control. The room felt like it was closing in around us, the walls pressing tighter with every passing second. The air was thick with an unnatural cold, a chill that seeped into our bones and made every breath feel like it was being drawn through ice. The oppressive silence of the facility had given way to an all-encompassing hum, a vibration that rattled my teeth and filled my chest. The thing, whatever it was still standing at the far end of the room, its shape shifting and writhing in the dim light. It wasn't human. It wasn't even remotely like anything I had ever seen. The best way to describe it would be fluid. The figure's limbs moved in an impossible dance, stretching and contorting as if they were not bound by the laws of physics. Its body flickered in and out of focus, its silhouette shifting like smoke. Every time I looked at it, it was something else. Long, spindly arms, then wide, gaping eyes, then mouths where none should have been. The space between the flickers seemed to bend in unnatural ways, distorting reality itself. I could hear the others breathing behind me, their panic palpable. Shani's breath was quick and shallow, her hands clutching the medical kit as if it could somehow protect her from the thing before us. Yair was muttering something under his breath, but I couldn't make out the words. His eyes were wide, fixed on the shape, his body frozen in place. Ophir's face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking as he stared at the entity, his fingers twitching, almost as if he were trying to communicate with it. But it wasn't his fingers he was twitching, it was his mind. The static hum of the room seemed to vibrate directly inside his head, pulling him into some dark trance. He looked like he was being pulled towards the creature, his expression blank, as though he had already been claimed. "Move!" I shouted again, my voice breaking the silence. I grabbed Yair's arm and pulled him toward the far wall, but his body was limp like a rag doll. He wasn't resisting. He wasn't even aware of what was happening anymore. I turned back to see Berman standing still, his gaze fixed on the entity as it seemed to stretch toward us. The figure was getting closer, its motions becoming more fluid, its form shifting with terrifying speed. I could feel the room pulsating with the entity's presence, like it was expanding in waves, filling the space with its own strange energy. The whispers had stopped, replaced by something worse. A deep, resonating hum, as if the entity itself was speaking without words. I could feel the vibrations of its voice deep inside me, at the core of my being. It wasn't language. It was something older, something that existed before sound itself. Then, as the entity moved closer, I saw its face, or what I thought was its face. It wasn't a face in the traditional sense. It was a shifting mass of shapes, constantly changing, never the same for more than a fraction of a second. Eyes blinked open and closed, mouths opened wide in a silent scream, and what I can only describe as tendrils of darkness seemed to ripple from within its form, twisting like serpents, stretching toward us. I could feel it in my chest, an overwhelming pressure, a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe. The air felt like it was vibrating with the entity's energy, and with each pulse, I could feel my very reality begin to unravel. "Berman!" I screamed again, but this time my voice felt foreign, distant, like it was being distorted by the very air around us. I reached out to him, grabbing his shoulder and shaking him hard. His eyes finally met mine, but they were empty, hollow. There was no recognition in them, no awareness. He had already been claimed. The man I had known, the steady, reliable leader, was gone. The entity had him now, its tendrils wrapping around him like a living thing, pulling him closer. His body twisted and bent in ways that should have been impossible, his mouth opening in a silent scream, but no sound came out. His body began to contort unnaturally, his limbs stretching at odd angles, as though he were being pulled apart. The air in the room grew thick with a burning smell, like something ancient was being consumed by fire. The entity was feeding on him, taking him apart piece by piece, and yet, it didn't seem in a hurry. It was patient. I watched in horror as Berman's body was consumed by the entity. His form flickered and rippled in front of my eyes, each moment more impossible than the last. I couldn't tear my eyes away. There was no logic, no reason to it. His body seemed to dissolve, eaten by the thing, until there was nothing left but a dark, twisting mass in the center of the room. I staggered back, heart pounding, my thoughts racing as the room seemed to close in on me. The walls were stretching, bending, the ceiling overhead warping into jagged, impossible shapes. The entity, still watching, was now growing in size. The tendrils, if that's what they were reaching out toward us, not just toward Berman anymore. It was after all of us. Shawnee screamed, a high, thin sound that pierced the silence. She was already backing away, eyes wide with terror. Yair, his body still unresponsive, was beginning to twitch, his limbs jerking as though the entity had already begun to work its will on him. Ophir's eyes had rolled back in his head, his body trembling violently. The hum in the room was deafening now, the sound of something ancient, something that existed long before human life had begun to crawl on the surface of this planet. "We have to leave," I gasped, pulling Shawnee toward me. I could feel my pulse racing, my legs unsteady beneath me as the entity's gaze locked onto me. It knew we were the last ones left. It had already consumed Berman, and now it was waiting for us. But the walls were closing in. The room was no longer a room. It was a living thing, breathing, pulsing with the energy of the entity that had claimed it. The door was still gone, vanished. We had no way out. The only way was forward. I grabbed Shawnee's arm tightly, dragging her toward the far end of the room. But we were already too late. The figure was right behind us now, its tendrils stretching and reaching with a terrifying precision. It moved like smoke, too fast for us to escape. And then I saw it. The faintest glow at the far corner of the room. An exit. It wasn't real. I knew that now. But it was the only thing that felt like a chance. I pushed Shawnee toward it, my legs burning with the effort. But the room was collapsing around us. The entity was swallowing everything. The door we had once entered was gone. But ahead, there was another. And another. We were not escaping. The walls of the facility were no longer walls. The floor was no longer solid beneath my feet. Everything was shifting, melting, and distorting in ways that defied reason. The faint exit I had seen, if it had ever been real, was now gone, swallowed by the chaos that had overtaken the space. The air felt dense, almost viscous, clinging to my skin like wet cloth, the very atmosphere rejecting the presence of humanity. The hum that had filled the room before was now a constant thrum, vibrating through my chest, becoming almost unbearable. It was not a sound, not a voice. It was something deeper, something that reached into the very marrow of our bones, manipulating us, bending our perception. I pulled Shawnee forward, my grip tight on her arm, but she wasn't moving. She was staring at the floor, her face pale, lips trembling, as though she were frozen in place. I tried to shake her, but her body didn't respond. Instead, her eyes lifted, locked onto something beyond me, beyond the horrific entity. A shadow stretched from the corner of the room, blacker than the darkest night, and it was alive. "Shani!" I screamed, but she didn't respond. She was no longer herself. Her face had changed, twisted, contorted as though something inside her had been rewritten. Her eyes, once sharp and calculating, were now glassy, vacant. There was a strange, unnatural calmness to her demeanor, as though she were no longer fully aware of the world around her. It was like she was caught between two realities, one where she was still alive, still human, and another where she was something else entirely, something older, something not meant to exist. I stumbled backward, dragging her with me, but her feet no longer moved. She had become a dead weight, her body strangely heavy, as if it had already begun to fade from this plane of existence. A cold dread spread through me as I looked down at her, watching the shadows flicker and move, curling around her limbs like living serpents. "Shani, stay with me," I pleaded, my voice cracking. But she didn't answer. Her eyes stared forward, unblinking, as the shadows wrapped tighter around her. They were swallowing her whole, not physically, but in some other way. I could feel the change happening, like her very essence was being rewritten, remade into something unrecognizable. I could hear Yair's voice now, but it wasn't the same as before. His words came in distorted bursts, like a broken radio signal, as if his mind were slowly fracturing under the weight of the entity's influence. I turned to see him. He had backed up to the far wall, his hands pressed against it, as if he were trying to push it away. His face was flushed, his chest rising and falling with erratic breaths. I can't get it out," Yair was muttering, his voice growing weaker. "It's in my head. It won't stop. It won't stop." I reached for him, but as I did, I saw it. His body was changing. Slowly at first, like a ripple in the fabric of reality. His skin seemed to stretch, thin, and then begin to tear, as though something beneath it was pushing out. His fingers, once steady and confident, now curled at odd angles, elongated unnaturally, and his nails began to twist into sharp, grotesque points. His eyes widened, and for a split second, I could see the fear in them before it was replaced by an empty, hollow gaze. He screamed, a high, animalistic sound that echoed through the chamber, but it was too late. His body continued to contort, his spine lengthening with sickening cracks as his form grew impossibly tall. He was no longer Yair. The man who had stood beside me, my comrade, had been replaced by something monstrous, something twisted beyond recognition. The transformation was grotesque. His limbs snapped and reformed, his bones bending in ways they should not, as though the very nature of his being was being reconfigured by some alien force. I staggered back, nausea flooding my stomach as I watched him, unable to look away. His mouth opened wide, unnaturally wide, and a guttural, inhuman sound spilled out, reverberating through the chamber. He was no longer Yair, but a mockery of him, a creature formed of his worst fears, twisted by the entity's dark power. "Yair!" I screamed, my voice hoarse, but he didn't respond. The thing that had once been my team member turned its gaze toward me, and in that moment, I knew. I knew that whatever was happening to him, it was happening to all of us. The entity wasn't just feeding on our fear, it was rewriting us, altering us at a fundamental level. Shani was lost, Yair was lost, and I was next. I turned to Ophir, desperate for any shred of humanity that might remain, but when I looked at him, I saw that he had already begun to change as well. His body had grown unnaturally still, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. His hands were shaking, but it was his eyes that unnerved me the most. They were no longer focused on anything around him. They were distant, lost in some other world, a world that existed outside of ours. His fingers twitched as if typing on an invisible keyboard, his mouth moving soundlessly, forming words I could not hear. Ophir wasn't just altered physically, he had been connected to the entity in a way none of us fully understood. The whispers had been calling to him, his mind had become a conduit for their terrible language, and now he was becoming part of it. I could see it in the way his body quivered, as if something foreign were crawling beneath his skin, something not human. The transformation was happening so quickly now that I could no longer tell where one of us ended and the entity began. My mind screamed at me to fight, to break free. But it was like I was drowning in a sea of impossible forces. I could feel the entity in my bones, in my blood. It was rewriting my own perception of reality, bending it, breaking it, and then I felt it. A sharp pain in my chest, a deep, burning ache, like something was pulling me apart from the inside out. My vision blurred, and I gasped for breath, the air growing thick and suffocating. The walls were warping, shifting, the room expanding and contracting with impossible speed. The ground beneath my feet seemed to disappear entirely, leaving me floating, suspended in an endless void. The entity was in my mind now, digging into my thoughts, rewriting me, breaking me, and I knew that there was no escape, no way out. I was becoming like them. The pain in my chest was unbearable, a fire that spread through my body like molten lava. I stumbled, clutching at my ribs, gasping for air that felt thick with the presence of something not meant for this world. The room, if it could even be called that anymore, was folding in on itself, the walls collapsing and reforming as if they had become liquid. The light flickered in and out, casting the shadows into grotesque shapes that seemed to pulse and breathe with a life of their own. I felt myself slipping, my consciousness faltering as the entity's grip on me deepened, its cold tendrils burrowing deeper into my mind, reshaping it, tearing it apart. But even as I felt myself breaking, a part of me still clung to the reality I knew. I had to fight. I had to resist, even if it was hopeless. There was a flicker of resistance, something that remained untouched by the entity's influence, a last, desperate shred of humanity. I turned to face my team, or what remained of them. Shani's body was barely recognizable now, her form twisted, her skin stretched unnaturally, her face frozen in a look of vacant terror. She had stopped moving entirely, her eyes locked open, staring at nothing. Yair, what was left of him, was a towering, grotesque thing. His limbs had elongated beyond recognition, twisted into unnatural angles, his face a horrific mask of anguish and fury. He was no longer Yair. He had become a vessel, a conduit for the entity's power, its rage, its hunger. Ophir was no better. His eyes had gone dark, pupils dilated as if his mind had become consumed by the alien forces that were flowing through him. His body trembled violently, and his mouth opened and closed in sync with the eerie hum of the room. But there was no sound. His lips moved, but there were no words. It was as though he was speaking to something beyond the veil of reality, something that no longer existed within the laws of time or space. I could feel the entity now, not just in my body, but in my very soul. It was inside me, speaking to me through my thoughts, whispering in that alien language that defied understanding. But I understood. I could hear it, feel it in my bones, and I knew that it wasn't asking me to join it. It was demanding it. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were a chorus, an overwhelming force, telling me that I was already part of it, that my fate had already been sealed. The entity had been waiting for this moment for millennia, and now it was going to consume all that I was. In that moment, I realized something that sent a cold shiver down my spine. This was not an entity that sought destruction. It didn't need to destroy us. It was patient. It could wait for us to destroy ourselves. We were already lost. The entity didn't need to chase us or hunt us. It had simply guided us here, to this place, where our minds would break and our bodies would transform into vessels for its will. It didn't care if we survived the process. All that mattered was the final transformation, the exchange. The shadows around me began to deepen, and the air grew heavier, colder, until it felt like I was submerged in an ocean of ice. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble, a low, grinding sound that echoed from every corner of the room. The entity was moving, not in a way that could be seen, but in a way that could be felt. It was stretching out, breaking through the boundaries of the space we were trapped in, as if it were no longer confined by the physical laws of the facility. Reality itself was beginning to tear, unraveling at the edges, the very fabric of time and space buckling under the weight of the entity's power. I could feel my body shifting, changing. My limbs felt heavy, foreign. My thoughts scattered like dust in the wind. The pain that had gnawed at me earlier was now a dull ache. and a sickening warmth began to spread through my veins, as though my blood had become something other, something alien. The entity was inside me. It was feeding on me, bending me to its will. I could feel my mind slipping away, as though it were being pulled apart, thread by thread. My vision blurred, and the room spun around me in dizzying circles. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I tried to fight, to push back against the overwhelming presence, but it was futile. My body was no longer mine. The entity had taken it, just as it had taken Shani, Yair, and Ophir. We were no longer humans. We were vessels, containers for something ancient, something that had existed long before time had ever begun. It didn't matter who we were anymore. It didn't matter what we had been. We had become fuel for a power beyond our understanding. And then, with a final crushing force, the entity broke through completely. The walls of the room shattered, crumbling into dust as the world around me collapsed. I was floating in darkness now, weightless, as though I had been ripped free from the constraints of existence. The entity had breached the space between dimensions, tearing apart the thin veil that separated this reality from whatever lay beyond. The air was thick with the sound of millions of voices, distorted and ancient, each one calling, each one screaming. In that instant, I saw it. The entity. It was not just one thing. It was a multitude, a vast, sprawling presence that reached across every corner of the universe, its tendrils stretching out into the infinite, pulling at everything it touched. Its true form was beyond comprehension, beyond the limitations of language, a shifting mass of light and shadow, of pain and power, of memories that did not belong to this world. And then I understood. The entity wasn't trying to destroy us. It was trying to rebuild us. It was changing us into something else, something it had always intended for us to be. The walls between our minds and its reality were gone. There was no more separation. We had become part of it, and it was part of us. We were not simply victims. We were its chosen. But it wasn't over. There was still something left of us, something deep inside. And though we had been changed, we had not yet fully succumbed. There was still a part of me somewhere that fought. The darkness had swallowed us whole. I couldn't feel the ground beneath my feet anymore, couldn't feel my body at all. I was weightless, drifting in a sea of nothing, a black void that stretched infinitely in every direction. My senses were overwhelmed, assaulted by the presence of the entity. It was inside me, inside all of us, shifting and writhing in the recesses of our minds, twisting our thoughts, our memories. The whispers had become screams, each one tearing at my consciousness, pulling me apart, fragmenting me into pieces I could not hold on to. I tried to scream, but there was no sound, no breath, just the oppressive weight of the entity pressing against every fiber of my being. It wasn't just in my mind anymore. It was in my soul. I could feel it, a presence that stretched beyond the boundaries of space and time, reaching into places I couldn't comprehend. It was patient, its power slow and inevitable, like the tide washing over a crumbling cliff. But there was something in me, something buried deep beneath the entity's reach, that fought. I tried to move, but my body refused to respond. It was as if the very fabric of my being had been unmade, stripped of its human form. My limbs felt wrong, foreign, twisted, as though they no longer belonged to me. But there was a spark, a faint glimmer of awareness, something that had not been completely consumed. I focused on that flicker, on that small, fragile thread of self that remained. I pushed against the overwhelming presence, trying to force my body to obey, trying to fight against the pull of the darkness. Slowly, agonizingly, I began to move. The void around me seemed to shift, pulling me in different directions as I struggled to orient myself, to find something, anything that could help. My thoughts were hazy, fragmented, but I could feel the pressure around me beginning to shift. The entity was still there, its presence an overwhelming force, but I felt something else, a tug, like a string pulling me, leading me toward the surface. It was faint, like a whisper from another life, but it was enough to give me something to hold on to. The whispers, the voices, were all around me now, louder, more insistent. But I pushed them away, focusing only on the tug that had become my only anchor. I reached out, and for a moment, I thought I could feel something solid, something real, something outside of the crushing blackness. My hand brushed against what felt like a wall, smooth and cold to the touch, but the sensation was fleeting, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. Still, it was enough to drive me forward, my body moving through the void like a desperate animal clawing its way to freedom. I focused harder, straining against the waves of pressure that threatened to crush me. I could feel the entity pressing down on me, tightening its grip, but I refused to give in. I had to escape. I had to get out. Whatever had happened to Shani, Yair, and Ophir, whatever the entity had done to them, it was too much. They were lost. But I wasn't. Not yet. Suddenly, a flash of light, a crack in the darkness, a thin sliver of illumination. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I surged toward it, every muscle in my body screaming in protest as I fought against the unnatural force that surrounded me. The light grew brighter, and I felt myself moving faster, as though I were being pulled toward it by some invisible force. The hum in my ears had become deafening, the air thick with the vibrations of the entity's power. But the light was closer now. I reached out again, desperate, and this time I felt something solid, cold metal under my fingers. A door, a way out. With a final, desperate push, I pulled myself through the opening, and in an instant I was no longer in the void. I was back in the facility, but everything had changed. The walls were no longer warping and shifting. The floor beneath me felt solid once more. The light was harsh, artificial, but it was real. The air was thick, but not with the oppressive force of the entity. No, this air felt almost normal. I gasped for breath, my chest heaving as I stumbled forward, my body trembling from the strain. I looked around, my eyes darting, but there was no sign of Shani, Yair, or Ophir. The space was empty, silent. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating, that I hadn't truly escaped, that the entity was still there, waiting to claim me once again. But there was no presence, no pressure. The door I had passed through stood behind me, closed, its surface smooth and unmarked. It had been the source of the light, and now it was silent, as though it had never existed. I didn't understand it. I didn't understand how I had managed to break free from the grasp of the entity. But I knew one thing. Whatever had just happened, whatever that space was, it was not part of the same reality I had known. I had crossed something, perhaps a threshold, perhaps a rift in time or space, but I was no longer where I had been. I stumbled forward, each step feeling like a battle against my own body. The fatigue was overwhelming, as though every ounce of my energy had been drained, but I kept moving. I didn't know where I was going, didn't know if there was any real escape, but I had to keep going. I couldn't stay in that place. I couldn't let the entity take me again. As I moved deeper into the facility, I felt a coldness spreading through my chest. A thought, no, a voice, a whisper flickered through my mind. It was faint at first, but it was there. But it can wait. It does not need you now, but it will when you are ready. And I knew that I had not escaped. I had merely been given time, a brief respite, a delay. The entity was patient. It did not need to destroy me. It could wait for me to finish destroying myself. The days following my escape were a blur, shattered fragments of time that made no sense. I woke up in a sterile white room, disoriented and unable to grasp what had truly happened. My body felt foreign to me, each movement sluggish and weighted, as if I were being held down by an invisible force. The first thing I noticed was the silence, the oppressive hum, the whispers that had filled my mind, the sensation of being watched. All of it was gone. But the emptiness left behind was just as terrifying. It was a silence that screamed. I tried to piece together what had happened, what I had escaped from, but it was like trying to remember a dream that faded the moment you woke. The fragments were there. Shani, Yair, and Ophir. their faces twisted by the entity, their bodies broken by its power. But they were just that now. Fragments. I couldn't make sense of them, couldn't understand what had become of them. I was alone. They were gone. And though the entity's presence had receded, I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. The facility was empty. The walls stood still, quiet, like they were just structures, as if nothing had ever happened there. But I knew better. Something had changed in me. I could feel it in the back of my mind, a faint tremor, a whisper that had somehow followed me back. The entity's influence had left its mark, and now it was only a matter of time before it would claim me again. It was just waiting. As I stumbled through the empty halls of the facility trying to find an exit, I realized something disturbing. I wasn't alone. I wasn't the only one who had been changed. The walls had begun to shift again, not in the grotesque, unnatural way they had before, but in subtle, quiet movements. The air had grown thick with a pressure that was almost familiar, like the entity's presence was still there. But this time, it was inside me. Silent, patient, waiting for me to break. I moved through the abandoned halls, each footstep echoing, but I felt it. The coldness, the emptiness creeping in, spreading. As I passed the doors and the windows, I began to see the shadows again, moving in the corners of my vision, flickering and undulating like smoke. They weren't real, but they were real. They were a part of me now. I had become a part of it. I paused in front of a mirror, something that had been placed there for reasons I couldn't understand. I didn't recognize the face that stared back at me. My eyes were empty, lifeless, as if some part of me had already been taken, already been replaced. The person looking back at me wasn't me anymore. The man who had walked into that jungle, the one who had been so determined, was gone. In his place was a hollow shell, a vessel that had already been claimed. My reflection was distorted, as if the glass was warping in time with the whispers in my mind. I could see it now, the faint, dark lines that etched themselves into my skin, into my very bones. I had been marked by the entity. I turned away from the mirror, my stomach turning, and that's when I saw them. The others. They were there, standing in the doorway of the hallway, silent, unmoving. Shani, Yair, and Ophir, twisted, changed. Their bodies were different, yes, but more disturbing was the way their eyes stared at me. Hollow, vacant, but also knowing. They had seen something. Something beyond the veil that I had only barely glimpsed. And now, they were no longer themselves. They had been erased, rewritten. I stepped forward, but I felt the weight of their gaze on me, a pull that was both familiar and alien. They didn't move, didn't speak. There was nothing human left in them. They were shells, vessels for the entity's will, their bodies contorted and twisted into something that wasn't quite alive. Shani's face was expressionless, her eyes wide open and empty, but there was something else there, something darker. A faint, unsettling smile stretched across Yair's face, too wide, too unnerving. Ophir's mouth moved, silently, as though he were speaking in a language I couldn't understand. His skin was stretched tight over his bones, as if something inside him were pushing outward. I took a step back, my breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. The whispers in my mind grew louder, the pull stronger, and I realized what had happened. I had escaped, yes, but I had not truly left the entity. It was still inside me. I could feel it in my blood, in my very thoughts. I could feel its tendrils reaching into the deepest corners of my mind, rewriting who I was, remaking me in its image. It wasn't just a physical transformation. It was mental, spiritual. It was as though the entity had taken everything that was me and replaced it with something else. It wasn't finished with me yet. It never would be. I turned away from them, my mind racing, searching for some way out. I had to leave, but there was nowhere to go. The facility was an endless maze, and the walls were closing in again, reshaping themselves. The doors were no longer doors. The windows were no longer windows, they were gateways, gateways to something worse, something beyond. I ran, not knowing where I was going, but knowing I couldn't stop. I couldn't stay here, I couldn't be here with them, my team, my friends, my comrades, who were now just echoes of their former selves, husks of the people they once were. And then I heard it. A voice, faint but unmistakable. Not a whisper, not a sound, but a presence, a call. Come back. I stopped dead in my tracks. The words didn't come from my mind. They came from the walls, from the air, from the very fabric of this place. And they weren't just calling me, they were calling all of us. The entity had not let go. It was waiting for us to finish destroying ourselves. But it was patient. It could wait. The extraction was too smooth, too easy. The moment I stepped into the waiting transport, I could feel it. The shift, the change, the oppressive weight that had hung over me since that first moment in the jungle was gone, replaced by a different kind of heaviness, one that was quieter, more insidious. My mind was still scrambled, still struggling to make sense of everything that had happened. Shani, Yair, Ofer, the entity, the transformation. All of it felt like a fragmented nightmare that refused to let go. Yet here I was, sitting in a sterile transport vehicle, my breath shallow, trying to force my mind to believe that it was over, that I had escaped. I was wrong. The officers who greeted me at the base were calm, too calm. There was no urgency in their eyes, no recognition of what I had just gone through. Their faces were impassive, as though they were seeing something ordinary, something routine, as if nothing had changed. They didn't seem surprised by the fact that I was the only one who had made it out. No questions, no concern, just sterile efficiency. They moved me through the debriefing process mechanically, asking questions that didn't matter. They already knew everything they needed to know. They didn't care about the horror we'd faced. They didn't care about the entity or the way it had ripped through our minds. They only cared about the sanitized version of the mission I was now expected to recount in perfect detail. Everything went according to plan, Agent Yuri? The officer asked, his voice flat, disinterested. His eyes never met mine as he jotted something down on a pad. I hesitated for a moment, the words forming in my throat like broken glass. I knew what was expected of me. I knew how this would go. But the words stuck. How could I explain what had really happened? How could I explain the entity, the corruption that had twisted us all, the way it had shaped my comrades into something unrecognizable? I opened my mouth, but no words came. Yes, I finally muttered, my voice a hollow echo of what it once was. The mission was successful. We retrieved the data. The officer nodded, scribbling something else. Anything unusual in the facility? Another pause. The entity, the shadows, the way the walls moved, the way I had felt it crawling inside me, rewriting who I was. I could feel its presence, even now, lingering at the edges of my mind. But I couldn't speak it. I couldn't even think it without my thoughts warping, slipping into something that was no longer mine. I could feel it, cold and patient, waiting for me to falter. No, I said, my voice trembling, though I tried to force the calmness I had once known. Nothing unusual. The officer didn't seem to notice my unease. He simply continued asking questions, but they no longer felt important. They were just motions, routine. The real questions, the real answers, had been buried. I could feel them pressing against the surface of my mind, pushing for release. But I knew that if I let them out, I would lose myself completely. The entity had already claimed so much of me. I could feel it curling around my thoughts, weaving itself into my memories. I had to suppress it. I had to pretend that everything was normal. At some point, the debriefing ended. I don't remember when exactly. I had been moved through so many rooms, so many doors, but they all blurred together into a sterile, endless cycle. The walls of the facility were like the walls of my mind, bleached white, empty, hollow. The walls that had once been alive with the entity's presence now stood silent, but I knew better. The silence was a lie. The real terror wasn't in the mission anymore. It was in the memories that were starting to fade, slipping out of reach like smoke through my fingers. They moved me to a new room, another sterile place, another blank canvas for the lies they would feed me. I wasn't sure if the room was real or just another construct of the entity's influence. It felt like a place outside of time, too clean, too perfect, too empty. I sat there for hours, days, weeks maybe, without speaking. I was a prisoner, but I wasn't locked in a cell. I was locked inside my own mind, and the doors were sealed from the inside. No one came to check on me. No one asked about the details of the mission again. It was as if the operation had never happened, as if nothing had gone wrong. My mind was starting to fracture, to unravel in ways that felt wrong. The room was no longer just a room. It was a cage, a holding cell for a part of me that still resisted, still remembered what had happened. But that part was dying. It was fading. The entity's presence was so deep inside me now that I could feel it in every thought, in every word I spoke. It wasn't just my memories that were being erased. It was me. They came for me once more, but this time it was different. Their eyes were empty, vacant, as if they had already been rewritten. They were just like the others, the ones who had come before, the ones who had disappeared into the void. They moved in sync, mechanical, like puppets. They didn't need to say anything. They didn't need to ask me questions anymore. They just handed me a new assignment, the details already sealed, already decided. I wasn't supposed to remember what had happened. I wasn't supposed to question. I signed the papers. My signature was a ghost, but as they led me away, I heard it, the faintest whisper in the back of my mind, a voice I could no longer ignore. It was the entity. It was patient. It was waiting. It has been weeks since the debriefing. I sit in my apartment now, though it feels more like a tomb than a home. The walls, once familiar, now seem alien, cold, too clean, and silent. Everything around me is meticulously ordered, sterile, just like the facility where I was held, just like the mission I no longer remember fully. I can feel the weight of the air, thick with something I can't quite place, pressing down on me. It's not the same as before. It's more subtle now, like a quiet hum in the background of my thoughts, always there, always waiting. The shadows in my room move differently now. They don't stay where they should, curling along the corners of the walls as though they have minds of their own. Every time I turn my back, they shift, stretching into impossible shapes, just beyond the edges of my vision. I've tried to ignore them, but I can feel them. Feel them. The more I try to focus on something else, the more they stretch and ripple, as if they're reaching for me, trying to drag me back into the space where the entity waits. The lights in my apartment flicker at times, too. Not just from faulty wiring or a momentary power surge. No. These flickers are deliberate. Sometimes they form symbols, unfamiliar, glowing patterns that don't make sense, yet they're painfully familiar. As though I should recognize them, but they elude me the moment I try. I've tried to write them down, to sketch them out, but the symbols fade as soon as my pen touches paper. The moment I look away, they vanish. It's as though they never existed at all. I've stopped sleeping. When I close my eyes, I don't see the darkness. I see the void, the space that the entity has carved into my mind, a place where I can no longer escape its presence. I hear it calling sometimes, faintly at first, like a distant murmur. Then, louder. It's always there. The voice, the hum, the whisper that no one else can hear. It has woven itself into my thoughts, shaping them, pushing me towards something I can't name. It's waiting for me. I know that now. It will never let me go. Tonight, I woke in a cold sweat. I was no longer in my bed. I was standing by the window, looking out at the street below, but everything felt wrong. The city outside was too quiet, too still. The streets were empty, the buildings looming in the night like abandoned husks. My apartment, the whole city, felt empty, like it was no longer part of the world I knew. I stepped closer to the window, and that's when I saw it. The reflection in the glass wasn't mine. It was distorted, twisted. My face was pale, gaunt, hollow. The eyes that stared back at me were not the eyes of the man I had been. They were dark, empty, filled with something alien, something old. The figure behind me, my reflection, smiled. But it wasn't me. I didn't smile. The reflection's grin stretched wider, unnaturally so, like it was being pulled into a shape it didn't belong in. My hand trembled as I reached for the windowpane, but the moment my fingers touched the glass, the reflection vanished. The city outside flickered, and I was back in my apartment, standing in the dark, with the same emptiness surrounding me. But the silence was different now, heavy with the weight of what I knew. The entity was here, just beyond the surface of my reality. I could feel it, always. It was in the shadows, in the spaces between my thoughts, in the flickering lights, and in the very fabric of my memories. I turned away from the window, my heart pounding, my chest tight with the suffocating pressure of it all. My thoughts are no longer my own. The words I speak come from somewhere else. The whispers, the entity, are now part of me, a permanent fixture of my mind, my body, my soul. I hear its voice more clearly now, in my own thoughts, in my own dreams. It doesn't need to destroy me. It can wait. It has all the time in the world. And I will destroy myself. Slowly, piece by piece. I know it is inevitable. As I sit here in my apartment watching the shadows stretch across the walls, I hear the footsteps again, heavy, deliberate, and not human. They are coming from the hallway outside my door. I've heard them before, but they are always too distant, too faint to confirm. But tonight they are closer. So close I can hear them clearly. I rise, my body moving of its own accord, my legs trembling as I move toward the door. I know what's on the other side. I know what will be waiting for me. The entity is patient. It doesn't need to destroy us. It can wait for us to finish destroying ourselves. And in that moment, as I open the door and step into the darkness beyond, I know that I will never escape.